Lord Peregrine Ashford paused beneath the carved stone lintel of Greymere Abbey's entrance hall, his pale eyes fixed upon the brass memorial tablet with the sort of pained expression typically reserved for watching amateur theatricals. The inscription, newly polished and gleaming with civic pride, proclaimed in flowing Gothic script, Requiem aeternam dona eis, Domine eternal rest grant unto them, O Lord. I say, Vicar, he murmured to the Reverend Dr. Whitmore, who was hovering nearby with the anxious air of a man expecting either praise or catastrophe. One does hope the late Mrs. Pemberton was not quite so careless with her temporal affairs as her memorial suggests she was with her Latin grammar. The vicar blinked owlishly. I beg your pardon, Lord Ashford? Ice, my dear fellow, the dative plural. One grants rest unto them, presumably referring to multiple souls departed. Rather presumptuous for a single interment, wouldn't you say? Unless, of course, Mrs. Pemberton was expecting company. Ashford adjusted his monocle with the delicate precision of a surgeon. A would be more grammatically appropriate for the singular, though I suspect your mason was thinking of the more familiar mass for the dead. This pedantic observation proved remarkably prophetic, for within the hour, Mrs. Pemberton's widower was discovered in circumstances that suggested he had indeed joined his late wife with unseemly haste. The discovery was made by Hodgins, the butler, whose devotion to punctuality had led him to investigate when Mr. Pemberton failed to appear for his customary afternoon brandy. The study door was locked from within, the key still dangling from the interior lock like an accusation. Through the window, Hodgins could see his master slumped forward at his writing desk, apparently having succumbed to the same heart condition that had claimed his wife merely 3 weeks prior. Dr. Thornley, summoned hastily from the village, pronounced it a textbook case of cardiac arrest. Grief, you know, he explained to the assembled household with the comfortable authority of a man who had attended 3 generations of Pembertons. Quite common in elderly couples. The shock of loss, the disruption of established patterns, the heart simply gives out. Lord Ashford, who had been visiting the vicarage regarding the restoration of some medieval manuscripts, arrived as the constable was taking his preliminary notes. He surveyed the scene with the detached interest of a connoisseur examining a questionable attribution. Most considerate of him, Ashford observed, noting the neat arrangement of papers on the desk, to expire so tidily. One might almost think he had made an appointment with mortality. The study presented a picture of scholarly order. Leather-bound volumes lined the walls in precise rows, their gold lettering catching the afternoon light that slanted through tall windows. Mr. Pemberton sat in his chair as if he had simply dozed off while reading, his spectacles still perched upon his nose, his right hand resting beside an open book. What was he reading? Ashford inquired, approaching the desk with the careful steps of a man accustomed to observing details others overlooked. Constable Briggs consulted his notebook. Appears to be Cicero, my lord. De senectute something about old age, the doctor says. How appropriately morbid, Ashford murmured, though his tone carried a note of gentle skepticism. He leaned closer, noting that the book lay open to page 47, marked by what appeared to be a pressed flower, a white rose, brown at the edges with age. Tell me, Constable, was Mr. Pemberton in the habit of pressing flowers in his classical texts? Hodgins, who had been standing in respectful silence, cleared his throat. Not to my knowledge, my lord. The master was most particular about his books, never so much as a turned-down page. Indeed, Ashford's eyebrows rose fractionally. And yet, here we find a botanical specimen serving as bookmark. Rather sentimental for a classical scholar, wouldn't you say? Dr. Thornley shifted uncomfortably. Perhaps a memento of his late wife. She was fond of the rose garden. Quite possibly. Ashford agreed, though he made no move to close the book. Instead, he examined the pressed flower more closely, noting its placement and the faint stain it had left upon the page. Though one might wonder why he chose to mark this particular passage. Cicero's thoughts on the consolations of philosophy seem rather at odds with pressing romantic mementos. The constable dutifully noted this observation, though his expression suggested he found it of questionable relevance to a straightforward case of natural death. Lord Ashford, however, continued his examination with the methodical patience of a man who had learned that the most insignificant details often proved the most illuminating. Outside, the afternoon shadows were lengthening across Greymere's ancient lawns, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, the first notes of a mystery were beginning to sound as subtle and persistent as the tolling of a distant bell. The pressed flower seemed to mock the orderly precision of everything else in the study, and Lord Ashford found himself returning to it with the persistence of a man who had learned that anomalies, however small, rarely occurred in isolation. He lifted the Cicero with reverent care, noting that the volume fell open naturally to page 47, as though it had been consulted repeatedly. "Hodgins," he said, without looking up from the book, "I wonder if you might enlighten me about your master's reading habits. Was he in the custom of marking his place with botanical specimens?" The butler approached with measured steps, his weathered face creasing with what appeared to be genuine perplexity. "Indeed not, my lord. The master was most particular about his books. Never so much as a turned-down page, as I've mentioned. He kept proper bookmarks, leather strips with silk ribbons in the desk drawer there." Ashford opened the indicated drawer, revealing a neat collection of tooled leather bookmarks, each bearing the Pemberton crest. "Then this white rose represents something of a departure from established practice." He examined the pressed flower more closely, noting its placement and the faint stain it had left upon Cicero's meditation on the consolations of age. "Tell me, when did Mrs. Pemberton pass away exactly?" "The 15th of September, my lord. A sudden fever, as Dr. Thornley can attest. She was tending her roses in the morning and taken ill by evening." "And this would have been during the final blooming of her white roses?" "Oh yes, my lord. The autumn varieties were her particular pride. She often said they were the most beautiful of the year, coming as they did when other flowers had begun to fade." Ashford nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the study itself. The magnificent Persian carpet, a tabriz of considerable age and value, drew his notice. "This carpet appears to have been recently repositioned," he observed, gesturing with his walking stick toward the area beneath Pemberton's desk. "The pile lies differently here, and one can still discern the original indentations from the desk legs." Hodgins approached and examined the carpet with the careful attention of a man responsible for household maintenance. "Most peculiar, my lord. The desk has occupied that precise position for nearly 20 years, ever since the late mistress arranged the room to her satisfaction. Yet, here we see it has been moved perhaps 6 inches in each direction and then replaced, but not quite accurately." Ashford crouched beside the desk, running his fingers along the carpet's surface. "The question becomes, why would anyone move such a substantial piece of furniture, and why replace it imprecisely?" Dr. Thornley, who had been growing restless with these apparent irrelevancies, interjected from his position near the body. "Perhaps the undertakers moved it when they came for Mrs. Pemberton? These old houses sometimes require furniture to be shifted for such purposes." "Quite possibly," Ashford agreed, though his tone carried a note of gentle skepticism. "Though one might wonder why undertakers would concern themselves with Mr. Pemberton's study when Mrs. Pemberton passed away in her bedroom upstairs." The doctor's face reddened slightly, but before he could respond, Ashford had moved to examine the desk itself. The blotting pad was immaculate in a way that suggested recent use and careful adjustment. The pen lay parallel to the edge of the paper with surveyor-like precision, but when Ashford lifted it to examine the nib, he made a small sound of interest. "The ink, Hodgins. What type does your master typically employ?" "The purple, my lord, from the Standish there. Mrs. Pemberton always complained it stained his cuffs, but he preferred it for correspondence." Ashford examined the inkwell. The purple ink showed signs of regular use, but the pen in his hand bore traces of a different substance entirely, a darker, almost oily black ink that had not come from the study's supplies. "Yet this pen has been used with black ink, and quite recently." Mrs. Betts appeared in the doorway at that moment, her substantial figure clothed in mourning black, her hands clasped before her with the rigid propriety of long service. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but I couldn't help overhearing. The master did receive correspondence this morning from his solicitor in London. Perhaps he used different ink for his reply?" "An excellent suggestion, Mrs. Betts. Though I notice the letter itself appears to have been written in purple ink." Ashford indicated the half-finished letter on the desk, then moved to examine the tall windows that dominated the study's eastern wall. "These windows face the rose garden, I presume?" "Yes, my lord," Mrs. Betts confirmed. The late mistress spent many happy hours among her roses. The master often said it gave him comfort to watch her at work. "And yet," Ashford observed, running his finger along the window-sill and examining the residue, "there appears to be a thin layer of dust here, suggesting these windows have not been opened recently." Rather curious for a man who found solace in observing his wife's garden, particularly during what would have been the final blooming of the season. Hodgins shifted uncomfortably. "Since the mistress passed, my lord, the master seemed to avoid this room. When he did use it, he kept the curtains drawn." Said the light troubled his eyes. "Grief affects people differently," Dr. Thornley offered, though his voice lacked conviction. "Indeed," Ashford murmured, examining the window's lock mechanism, "though I notice this particular fitting has been recently maintained. The brass shows signs of fresh polishing, and the mechanism moves quite freely. Curious. Care for a window that was supposedly never opened." He turned back to the room, his pale eyes taking in details that others had overlooked. "Mrs. Betts, I understand, Mrs. Pemberton was something of a collector?" The housekeeper's expression grew thoughtful. "Oh yes, my lord. She had quite an extensive collection of mourning jewelry antique pieces, some dating back centuries. She kept them in a locked cabinet in her dressing room. Said they reminded her of the continuity of human sorrow and the comfort of ritual. A philosophically minded lady. And Mr. Pemberton's behavior in recent days, had you noticed any changes?" Mrs. Betts exchanged a meaningful glance with Hodgins before responding. "He had been rather restless, my lord, not sleeping well, according to his valet, and he spent long hours in the library, often talking to himself. But then, grief does strange things to a person." Ashford nodded slowly, his gaze returning to the pressed white rose that marked Cicero's thoughts on old age. The flower was beautiful even in its dried state, but something about its placement continued to trouble him, a persistent sense that this carefully preserved bloom was not quite what it appeared to be, any more than the death it had been chosen to commemorate. The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Graymere's ancient lawns, and somewhere in the gathering dusk, the pieces of a puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in patterns that spoke of secrets more complex than simple grief, and far more dangerous than the natural failure of an elderly heart. The pressed white rose continued to occupy Lord Ashford's attention with the persistence of an unsolved equation, and he found himself returning to it as one might worry at a loose tooth. The afternoon shadows had begun their stately procession across Graymere's ancient carpets, when the sound of purposeful footsteps announced the arrival of Inspector Meadows from the county constabulary, a man whose brisk efficiency suggested he had encountered enough sudden deaths to recognize the obvious when it presented itself with such apparent clarity. "Natural causes, I should think," Inspector Meadows announced after a cursory examination of the scene, consulting his notebook with the satisfied air of a man eager to conclude a straightforward matter. "Elderly gentleman, recent bereavement, weak heart, rather textbook, really. Dr. Thornley's assessment appears entirely sound." Lord Ashford, who had been examining the mantel clock with unusual interest, glanced up with the mild expression of one observing a particularly predictable theatrical performance. "Quite possibly, Inspector, though I confess myself curious about certain domestic arrangements that seem rather at odds with such a tidy conclusion." He gestured toward the timepiece with his walking stick. "This clock, for instance, has gained precisely 7 minutes on Greenwich time. Hodgins informs me it was wound last Sunday, most regular. Household. This, and yet here we find it running fast. Rather suggests someone has been adjusting the mechanism, wouldn't you say?" Inspector Meadows frowned at the clock face, noting for the first time the faint smear on the glass over the 4, as though a finger had touched it and been hastily wiped clean. "Could mean anything, really. Clocks do run irregularly sometimes." "Indeed they do," Ashford agreed pleasantly, though one might wonder why someone would feel compelled to tamper with a timepiece in a house where punctuality was apparently sacred. He moved to examine the fireplace more closely, noting the faint residue of recent burning. "The grate has been used today, I observe. Rather unusual for such mild weather, wouldn't you say, Mrs. Betts?" The housekeeper approached with evident reluctance. "The master did request a fire this morning, my lord, though I thought it peculiar. He seemed quite agitated after the morning post arrived, a thick letter from his solicitors in Lincoln's Inn, sealed with red wax. And where might this correspondence be found now? The uncomfortable silence that followed provided its own answer. Ashford crouched beside the fireplace, extracting a small fragment of red sealing wax from among the ashes. "Sealing wax of excellent quality," he observed, holding it up to catch the light. "The sort employed by established legal firms. One might wonder what correspondence could prove so disturbing as to require immediate destruction." Before Inspector Meadows could formulate a response, the study door opened to admit a figure whose entrance managed to be both theatrical and genuinely distressed. Julian Pemberton swept into the room with a flurry of black crepe and barely suppressed emotion, his handkerchief pressed dramatically to his eyes. "Uncle Arthur, oh, the tragedy of it all," he exclaimed, his voice resonating with an affected tremor that made several observers wince. "First, dear Aunt Eleanor, and now this. The shock is simply too much for a grieving family to bear." Julian was a man in his early 30s, possessed of the sort of anxious, predatory air that suggested financial difficulties, poorly concealed beneath mourning attire that seemed a shade too theatrical for genuine grief. He surveyed the scene with practiced melancholy before turning his tear-filled gaze upon Inspector Meadows. "Inspector, I trust you are being thorough? This suddenness, it strains credulity." Uncle Arthur had the constitution of an ox, despite his recent sorrows. "Though I suppose the shock of losing dear Aunt Eleanor, the loneliness." He cast a meaningful glance at the desk, then at the fireplace. His devotion to her bordered on the obsessive, you understand. "Obsessive in what manner, precisely?" Ashford inquired with silken interest. Julian wrung his hands with practiced despair. He would spend hours simply watching her tend her roses, and since her passing, he refused to leave the house. Barely ate. It was tragic decline. And his financial affairs, oh, Inspector, that is another sorrow entirely. Uncle Arthur was a man of letters, not ledgers. He trusted his investments to rather dubious advisers, and my own small inheritance was unfortunately tied up in some of his less fortunate ventures. Inspector Meadows's eyes narrowed with the satisfaction of a man recognizing a familiar pattern. "So you stood to inherit, Mr. Julian? And your uncle's death leaves you in a precarious position?" "Only the remainder of his estate, after various bequests," Julian replied, dabbing at his eyes. "But yes, he was my last hope. My business ventures have not prospered as one might wish. We had a rather heated discussion about it only last week. He was quite obstinate about maintaining Aunt Eleanor's wishes regarding her mourning jewelry collection. She had some exquisite pieces, particularly in jet and onyx. Valuable, certainly, but he insisted they must pass to someone who understood their significance." Constable Briggs exchanged a knowing glance with Dr. Thornley. Here, at last, was motive served up with satisfying clarity. A desperate nephew, a substantial inheritance, a recent argument. The pieces seemed to arrange themselves with comfortable predictability. Lord Ashford, meanwhile, had returned his attention to the half-finished letter on the desk, noting once again the curious phrasing, "I cannot in good conscience proceed with the arrangement as proposed. The consequences would be too grave." He glanced at Julian's sleeve, observing a faint smear of ink, not the purple of Pemberton's Standish, but a deeper, oilier black. "You write in black ink, Mr. Pemberton?" he inquired mildly. Julian hesitated fractionally. "Sometimes. Everyone does, surely." "Not in this house," Ashford murmured, so softly that only Mrs. Betts made the involuntary sound that accompanies dawning comprehension. Inspector Meadows, satisfied with his obvious suspect, began making arrangements for a formal investigation. But Lord Ashford knew that the most apparent solution was invariably the least interesting, and almost certainly the most wrong. The scent of an easy resolution was merely the first, most pungent red herring in waters that promised to run considerably deeper and far more treacherous than anyone yet suspected. The afternoon shadows continued their inexorable advance across Greymere's Persian carpets, and with them came the growing certainty that this particular mystery would require considerably more than the arrest of a theatrical nephew to reach its proper conclusion. Lord Ashford observed Julian Pemberton's theatrical protestations with the detached interest of a connoisseur, examining a rather obvious forgery, though he found himself more intrigued by the domestic minutiae that seemed to contradict the nephew's touching portrait of familial devotion. The performance was competent enough: trembling hands, strategic deployment of handkerchief, the catch-in, the voice, but it possessed the fatal flaw of being precisely what one might expect from a guilty party attempting to appear innocent. "Most affecting," Ashford murmured, adjusting his monocle with surgical precision, "though I confess myself curious about certain chronological irregularities that seem rather at odds with the natural order of things." He moved toward the mantel clock, his walking stick tapping thoughtfully against the carpet. "Hodgins, at what hour does Mr. Pemberton ordinarily take his brandy?" The butler straightened with the automatic precision of long service. 4:30 to the minute, my lord. I lay it on the Georgian salver and knock at the study door. If he says, 'In a moment, Hodgins,' I return at 4:35. He never permitted delay beyond the quarter hour. And today? I knocked at the appointed time, my lord. No answer. I waited the customary 5 minutes. One does not obtrude upon grief, then tried the door. It was locked from within. I peered through the window and observed the master slumped as you see him now. Ashford nodded thoughtfully, then gestured toward the timepiece with his walking stick. This clock, you will observe, runs precisely 7 minutes fast by Greenwich time. Most curious for a household where punctuality was apparently sacred. He examined the clock face more closely, noting a faint smudge on the glass near the 4 o'clock position. Someone has been adjusting the mechanism, and recently, the question becomes, why would anyone feel compelled to tamper with a timepiece in a house where temporal precision was treated as a religious observance? Inspector Meadows frowned at the clock face, noting for the first time the telltale smear. Could mean anything, really. Clocks do run irregularly sometimes. Indeed they do, Ashford agreed pleasantly. Though one might wonder why the Abbey bell chimed the 3/4 hour at precisely 4:45, while this clock would have shown 4:52, rather creates an interesting discrepancy in our timeline, wouldn't you say? Julian shifted uncomfortably, his theatrical grief beginning to show hairline cracks. Uncle Arthur was growing forgetful. Perhaps he simply wound it incorrectly. Forgetful enough to mismanage a clock he had wound successfully for 20 years? Rather unlikely. Ashford moved to examine the Persian carpet once more, his pale eyes taking in details others had overlooked. Though speaking of irregularities, one notices this magnificent Tabriz has been recently repositioned. The pile lies differently here, and one can still discern the original indentations from the desk legs. Yet Hodgins informs me this desk has occupied its precise position for nearly 2 decades. He crouched beside the heavy mahogany piece, running his fingers along the carpet's surface. The desk has been moved perhaps 6 inches in each direction and then replaced, but not quite accurately. Most curious behavior for a man, supposedly, dying of natural causes. Mrs. Betts approached with evident reluctance. Perhaps the undertakers moved it when they came for Mrs. Pemberton? These old houses sometimes require furniture to be shifted for such purposes. An excellent suggestion, Ashford replied, though his tone carried that note of gentle skepticism that made Inspector Meadows bridle instinctively. Though one might wonder why undertakers would concern themselves with Mr. Pemberton's study when Mrs. Pemberton passed away in her bedroom upstairs. Unless, of course, they possessed an unusual interest in classical literature. He moved to examine the fireplace, where the fragment of red sealing wax lay like a tiny crimson accusation among the ashes. The grate has been used today, despite the mild weather. Mrs. Betts mentioned correspondence from Lincoln's Inn thick letter, red seal. One might wonder what legal communication could prove so disturbing as to require immediate destruction. Julian's hands had begun to tremble, though whether from genuine distress or mounting anxiety remained delicately ambiguous. Uncle Arthur was private about his affairs. Perhaps he simply preferred not to leave confidential matters lying about. Quite possibly, Ashford agreed, extracting the wax fragment with his penknife. Though sealing wax of this quality suggests correspondence of considerable importance, the sort that prudent men typically preserve rather than consign to flames. He examined the residue more closely. "Tell me, Mr. Julian, when did you last visit your uncle in this particular room?" Julian's eyes darted nervously about the study before settling on a point somewhere beyond Ashford's left shoulder. Several days ago, I should think, we discussed family matters, nothing of consequence. Indeed? How curious, then, that your footprints should be so clearly preserved in the carpet pile beside the fireplace. Ashford indicated the area with his stick, where the afternoon light revealed the faint but distinct impression of a boot sole. The pattern suggests someone stood there for some considerable time, perhaps while something burned. Most contemplative of you. The silence that followed was profound enough to make the mantel clock's irregular ticking sound like artillery fire. Constable Briggs exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Thornley. Here, at last, was evidence served up with satisfying clarity. Ashford, however, had moved to examine the tall windows that dominated the study's eastern wall. These windows face the rose garden, I presume. Your late aunt was particularly fond of white roses, I understand. Among others, Julian replied carefully, his composure showing further signs of strain. Yet this pressed specimen, Ashford indicated the flower marking Cicero's text, appears to be of the hybrid tea variety, Frau Karl Druschki, unless I'm much mistaken. Rather curious choice for a sentimental bookmark, particularly as it's not a variety currently cultivated in the garden. Mrs. Betts, perhaps you might enlighten us about Mrs. Pemberton's horticultural preferences. The housekeeper's face creased with concentration. The mistress did grow that variety, my lord, but she abandoned it 3 seasons past. Said it was too susceptible to disease. She preferred the hardier varieties in recent years. Most illuminating. Ashford's eyebrows rose fractionally. So we have a pressed flower from a rose no longer grown, marking a passage about the consolations of old age, in a book that has been incorrectly filed among the philosophical works rather than the rhetorical treatises where it properly belongs. One begins to suspect that someone has been rather busy arranging evidence. Julian's theatrical composure finally began to crack entirely. That proves nothing. Anyone could have, indeed, Ashford interrupted with uncharacteristic sharpness. Though one notices you write in black ink, Mr. Pemberton, while this household has used purple exclusively for correspondence. Rather distinctive, that oily black residue on your cuff. Inspector Meadows was growing visibly satisfied with the mounting evidence, but Lord Ashford knew that the most apparent solution was invariably the least interesting. The scent of an easy resolution was merely the first, most pungent red herring in waters that promised to run considerably deeper. "If you will indulge me, Inspector," Ashford said, moving toward the door with that air of quiet authority that made resistance seem rather futile. "I should like to examine Mrs. Pemberton's dressing room. Her collection of mourning jewelry is said to have been remarkable, and I am, in an amateur way, a student of cultural rituals." The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Greymere's ancient lawns, and somewhere in those shadows, the pieces of a considerably more complex puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in patterns that spoke of secrets far more intricate than simple, inheritance murder, and considerably more dangerous than anyone present had yet imagined. Mrs. Pemberton's dressing room occupied the southeast corner of Greymere's upper floor, its tall windows commanding an unobstructed view of the rose garden where she had spent her final morning among the autumn blooms. The chamber retained that peculiar hush of rooms where sentiment had outlived occupancy, perfumed still with lavender water and the faint, metallic sweetness of old potpourri. Heavy damask curtains filtered the declining afternoon light into a perpetual twilight that seemed appropriate for a shrine to Victorian melancholy. The mourning jewelry collection dominated the eastern wall within an ornate cabinet of carved oak, its glass doors revealing an extraordinary assemblage of jet, onyx, and worked hair arranged upon black velvet with museum-like precision. Each piece bore a small card in Mrs. Pemberton's meticulous handwriting, documenting provenance and the particular grief it commemorated, a reliquary of sorrow compartmentalized with an accountant's zeal. "Most edifying," Lord Ashford murmured, examining a bracelet whose clasp concealed a miniature portrait bordered with braided hair. "Though I observe certain gaps in this otherwise comprehensive display." He indicated a distinct impression in the velvet where something had recently resided. "Something appears to be missing from this particular space." Mrs. Betts approached with evident reluctance, producing an ornate key from her chatelaine. "The serpent brooch, my lord. Jet, with a gold tongue. The mistress called it her morbid favourite, said it reminded her that grief, like the serpent, devours its own tail. I discovered it missing last week, but dared not mention it to the master while he was so distressed. Ashford examined the lock mechanism, noting fresh scratches around the keyhole despite Mrs. Betts's protestations that she alone held access. Someone has been rather industrious with this cabinet, he observed, then moved to Mrs. Pemberton's writing desk, where a leather-bound journal lay open to its final entry, dated September 15th. The passage proved illuminating. A. Grows increasingly agitated about the Lincoln's Inn matter. I have told him my decision is final. The collection must pass to someone who understands its true significance, not merely its monetary value. Some secrets are too precious to be sold, even to satisfy debts. J's visit this morning was most unpleasant. He spoke of obligations and family duty, but I detected something more desperate in his manner. The white roses are particularly beautiful this season. Perhaps they know this shall be their last blooming under my care. Lincoln's Inn, Ashford repeated thoughtfully. The same legal firm whose correspondence Mr. Pemberton felt compelled to destroy, and a reference to your nephew's visit, I see, most illuminating regarding family dynamics. He moved to examine the fireplace, where recent ashes suggested someone had been burning documents in this supposedly abandoned room. Paper residue, he noted, extracting a fragment with his penknife. Part of what appears to be a legal document one can make out, party of the first part, and what might be a signature. Mrs. Betts shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Julian did visit that morning, my lord. Came quite early, before the mistress was taken ill. I heard voices from this room, rather heated discussion, though I couldn't make out the words. The mistress seemed quite upset afterward, spent the rest of the morning in her garden, working among the white roses. She kept looking back at the house, as though expecting something unpleasant. And Mr. Julian's departure? Rather abrupt, my lord, left without staying for luncheon, though he'd been invited. Ashford returned to the telephone in the hall, his pale eyes holding that distant expression that suggested calculations of considerable complexity. Miss Yates, he said into the receiver, you mentioned a trunk call to Lincoln's Inn this morning at 11:37. Might you recall who placed that call? Paper rustled faintly. That would have been Mr. Pemberton himself, sir. Quite agitated he was. Kept saying something about arrangements must be made immediately. Thank you. Most helpful. Ashford replaced the receiver and smiled at Inspector Meadows, who was growing visibly impatient with these apparent irrelevancies. One begins to detect a pattern, Inspector. Mrs. Pemberton refuses to alter her will, despite pressure from both husband and nephew. She dies rather conveniently of sudden fever. Her mourning jewelry begins disappearing. Legal correspondence arrives and is immediately destroyed. Someone manipulates the study clock to create false alibis. He paused beside the mantel clock, noting again the telltale smear on the glass. The chronology becomes quite fascinating when one considers that Hodgins discovered the body at 4:38 by Greenwich time, yet the mantel clock running 7 minutes fast would have shown 4:45. The Abbey bell chimed the actual 4:45 at 4:45, creating a discrepancy that someone hoped would go unnoticed. Julian Pemberton had grown increasingly pale during this recitation, his theatrical grief now entirely abandoned in favor of barely concealed anxiety. These coincidences prove nothing, he protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Coincidences rarely do, Ashford agreed pleasantly, though when arranged in proper sequence, they begin to resemble something rather more deliberate than chance. The question becomes, what secrets were worth 2 lives, and how does one commit murder in a locked room while maintaining the perfect alibi of being elsewhere entirely? The afternoon shadows were lengthening across Greymere's ancient lawns, and Lord Ashford was beginning to perceive the outline of a crime far more sophisticated than simple inheritance. Murder, one that required both patience and a thorough understanding of household routines, mechanical devices, and the precise timing that separated a perfect alibi from a hangman's noose. The telephone exchange proved most illuminating when Lord Ashford rang Miss Yates with the patient persistence of a man accustomed to extracting truth from the most reluctant sources. Her ledger, consulted with the reverence typically reserved for parish registers, revealed a chronology that cast Julian Pemberton's theatrical grief in an entirely different light. Most edifying, Ashford murmured into the receiver. An outgoing trunk call at 11:37 to Lincoln's Inn, connected for 13 minutes. 2 local calls at 3:16 and 3:22 to the vicarage and Dr. Thornley's surgery, respectively. And most significantly, an incoming call at 4:21 from the Market Ledbury public call box. He paused, allowing the implications to settle like sediment in still water. "Tell me, Miss Yates, you're quite certain about that 4:21 call?" "Oh, yes, my lord. I connected it myself." The gentleman sounded rather urgent, kept saying, "Graymere 4, please, quickly." Asked after Mr. Pemberton, specifically. Ashford replaced the receiver and turned to Julian with the mild expression of a man observing a particularly transparent card trick. "Most curious, Mr. Pemberton. You claim to have been taking tea at the Lion Hotel at 4:21, yet the telephone exchange records suggest you were simultaneously conducting urgent business from the Market Ledbury call box. Rather suggests talents that would make you invaluable to the music hall profession." Julian's theatrical composure finally began to show hairline cracks. "Aye, that is one might have stepped out briefly. The Lion's telephone was engaged, and I grew anxious about Uncle Arthur. Indeed, though Hodgins informs me he answered that call and assured you your uncle was in his study and not to be, disturbed the invariable rule between 4 and 5. Rather convenient timing for establishing that Mr. Pemberton was still alive at 4:21, wouldn't you say?" Inspector Meadows was beginning to show signs of genuine interest, his notebook poised with the satisfaction of a man recognizing familiar patterns. "So you're suggesting Mr. Julian telephoned to establish an alibi?" "Among other things," Ashford agreed, moving to examine the study's architectural features with renewed attention. The wall behind the desk showed subtle irregularities that spoke of alterations made long before the current tragedy. "These old houses are full of secrets, Inspector. Built during an era when concealed passages and priest holes were rather fashionable among the gentry." He pressed against a section of paneling that yielded slightly under pressure, revealing the faint outline of what had once been a concealed door. "Someone has been rather industrious with this particular feature. The scratches around the edges are quite recent, within the past fortnight, I should judge." Mrs. Betts approached with evident reluctance. "The back stairs do run along that wall, my lord, though I've never known of any connection to the study itself. Until recently, perhaps." Ashford examined the window mechanism once more, noting how smoothly the recently repaired lock operated. Grimsby's work was thorough, curious attention to detail for a window that was supposedly never opened, though I suspect the repairs served a purpose other than providing fresh air. He moved to Mrs. Pemberton's mourning jewelry cabinet, where the missing serpent brooch had left its accusatory impression in the black velvet. "This collection represents more than mere sentiment, I suspect. Mrs. Pemberton's journal mentions secrets too precious to be sold, rather suggests these pieces held significance beyond their monetary value." Lifting an ornate locket bearing the initial F, Ashford examined it with a jeweler's precision. "Tell me, Mrs. Betts, was Mrs. Pemberton's devotion to mourning jewelry a recent development, or had she maintained this collection for many years?" "Oh, many years, my lord. She began it as a young woman, after her first bereavement, said it helped her understand the continuity of human sorrow." "Her first bereavement?" Ashford's eyebrows rose fractionally. "I was under the impression she had been widowed only once." Mrs. Betts shifted uncomfortably. "Before Mr. Pemberton, there was a Captain Finch, lost at sea many years ago. She rarely spoke of him, but she treasured certain mementos." This revelation landed with the quiet force of a dropped stone in still water. Ashford examined the locket more closely, noting its unusual weight and the almost imperceptible seam along its edge. Most illuminating. And this correspondence from Lincoln's Inn, might it have concerned more than simple estate matters? Julian's hands had begun to tremble with what appeared to be genuine distress. "I know nothing about any correspondence. Uncle Arthur was secretive about his affairs, yet secretive enough to destroy urgent legal documents immediately upon receipt rather suggests matters of considerable delicacy." Ashford pocketed the locket with casual authority. "Inspector, I believe we shall require a more thorough examination of both the study's architectural features and Mrs. Pemberton's collection. The afternoon grows late, and I suspect our mystery has deeper roots than simple inheritance disputes. The shadows were lengthening across Greymere's ancient lawns, and with them came the growing certainty that this particular crime involved considerably more than a desperate nephew and a convenient heart attack. Someone had been very busy indeed, arranging alibis and evidence with the precision of a master clockmaker, though, like all mechanical devices, their calculations contained one fatal flaw that would ultimately prove their undoing. The afternoon, shadows had begun their stately procession across Greymere's Persian carpets when Lord Ashford rang for Grimsby, the estate's carpenter, with the patient persistence of a man who had learned that the most mundane witnesses often provided the most illuminating testimony. Inspector Meadows observed this development with the resignation of one who had begun to suspect that obvious solutions were invariably the least satisfactory to his lordship's peculiar intellect. Grimsby appeared with the cautious demeanour of a craftsman summoned to explain work that might prove more significant than originally intended. His hands bore the honest patina of years spent with wood and metal, and his eyes held that particular wariness of a man who sensed his handiwork had become evidence in matters beyond his comprehension. "You repaired the study window last week," Ashford began with deceptive mildness, as though inquiring about the weather. "A most thorough restoration, judging from the freedom of the Tentigno mechanism." "Aye, my lord." Mr. Pemberton sent word the sash had grown obstinate. "I freed the runners and attended to the brass fittings." Grimsby's eyes flickered toward the window with unconscious pride in workmanship well executed, and the small brass fitting beneath the lower sash. "Rather an unusual addition for a simple window repair." The carpenter shifted uncomfortably. "Begging your pardon, my lord, but the gentleman was most particular about that little eye. No bigger than a coat button, set flush with the inner rail. Said he wanted to hang a weather glass, though it seemed a queer place for such a thing." Ashford approached the window, his walking stick indicating the tiny brass ring that sat nearly invisible beneath the sash. "Or perhaps to guide a fine cord without chafing. Most ingenious for a man supposedly interested only in meteorological instruments." The implications settled over the room like morning mist, and Hodgins permitted himself a fractional adjustment of expression. "Now you mention it, my lord, I did discover a length of peculiar line some days past, stiff as wire, yet fine as silk, caught beneath the desk skirting. I removed it, thinking it fishing tackle gone astray." "Fishing tackle in a study devoted to classical literature? Rather suggests someone had been angling for more exotic prey than trout." Ashford's pale eyes held that distant expression that indicated calculations of considerable complexity. "Mrs. Betts, you will have consigned this mysterious cordage to the kitchen range as part of your eternal campaign against household clutter." "Naturally, my lord." The housekeeper replied with the righteous satisfaction of a woman who permitted no stray threads to survive her dominion. "A pity, though not unexpected." Ashford moved to examine the desk blotter with renewed attention, producing a soft pencil from his waistcoat. "Inspector, permit me to demonstrate a technique that rarely fails to illuminate the shadows of recent correspondence." With gentle strokes, he darkened the blotting paper's surface, and slowly, like figures emerging from fog, a network of reversed words began to appear. Inspector Meadows leaned forward as the ghostly text resolved into legible fragments. "Petition for inquiry. Marriage subsisting. Captain Frederick Finch. Sworn testimony. Lincoln's Inn." "Most illuminating," Ashford murmured, examining the reversed impressions with his magnifying glass. "It appears Mr. Pemberton's urgent correspondence concerned more than simple estate matters. The quality of legal phraseology suggests inquiries into matrimonial validity, rather awkward timing, considering recent domestic pressures." He moved to the locket retrieved from Mrs. Pemberton's collection, noting again its unusual weight and the almost imperceptible seam along its edge. With the delicate precision of a watchmaker, he applied pressure to the hidden mechanism, revealing not jewelry, but a folded document, compressed to fit the confined space. The paper proved to be a marriage certificate, dated 1851, recording the union of Eleanor Whitmore to Captain Frederick Finch of Her Majesty's Navy. The witness signatures bore the unmistakable authority of naval officers, and the Gibraltar Registry suggested a ceremony conducted in haste, but with official sanction. Captain Finch, not Captain Ashworth, as our theatrical nephew suggested, Ashford observed. Rather curious how family histories become embellished in the retelling, particularly when substantial inheritances hang in the balance. Julian Pemberton had grown increasingly pale during these revelations, his theatrical composure showing distinct signs of structural failure. These ancient documents prove nothing about Uncle Arthur's death. You're manufacturing mysteries where simple grief provides adequate explanation. Am I indeed? Ashford's attention returned to the mantel clock, its face showing that persistent 7-minute discrepancy. Though one might wonder why someone felt compelled to adjust a timepiece in a household where punctuality was treated as sacred duty, the chronology becomes quite fascinating when properly calculated. He moved to the telephone, consulting his pocket watch with theatrical precision. Miss Yates recorded your call from Market Ledbury at 4:21 Greenwich time. Hodgins answered and assured you that Mr. Pemberton was in his study and not to be disturbed. Yet this clock would have shown 4:28, creating the impression that you called 7 minutes later than actual fact. The silence that followed was profound enough to make the clock's irregular ticking sound like artillery fire. Ashford continued his methodical reconstruction with the patience of a surgeon performing a particularly delicate operation. Hodgins knocked at 4:30 Greenwich time, which this manipulated timepiece would have shown as 4:37. No response. He waited the customary 5 minutes and tried again. 4:35, actual, 4:42 by the study clock. Still no answer, prompting him to investigate through the window. The locked door presented our murderer's masterpiece, Ashford continued, moving to examine the study's architectural features. The concealed passage, recently reopened after decades of disuse, provided access. The desk moved precisely 6 inches to clear the hidden door, then replaced imprecisely in apparent haste. He demonstrated the brass eye's function with a length of string borrowed from Mrs. Betts's workbasket. A fine cord, passed through this obliging brass fitting, could manipulate the door key from within the passage. The key appears locked from inside, though actually controlled from without. A pull of precise tension turns the mechanism. A sharp jerk returns it to the vertical position where habit expects to find it. Inspector Meadows was beginning to show genuine comprehension. But the murder itself? Heart failure can be induced, but not from outside a locked room. Unless the victim was already deceased when the room was locked, Ashford replied with quiet authority. The brandy service provides our answer. Hodgins mentioned the Georgian salver had gone missing, most convenient for someone requiring an untraceable vessel for delivering a final drink. The salver has since been cleaned and returned, but certain alkaloids leave traces that careful analysis might yet detect. Julian's theatrical composure finally collapsed entirely. You're suggesting I poisoned Uncle Arthur, then staged an elaborate locked room deception? The accusation is preposterous. I suggest nothing, Ashford replied with silken precision. I merely observe that someone with intimate knowledge of household routines, architectural secrets, and family genealogy orchestrated a remarkably sophisticated deception. Someone who knew precisely when Hodgins would discover the body, exactly how long telephone alibis required for establishment, and which legal documents demanded immediate destruction. He indicated the brass eye with his walking stick. The window modification was commissioned after Mrs. Pemberton's death, but before the legal inquiries arrived. Rather suggests advanced planning of considerable scope. The pressed white rose marking Cicero's text from a variety abandoned 3 seasons past provided the final theatrical flourish for a mind that apparently could not resist over-elaborating its deceptions. The afternoon? Shadows were lengthening across Greymere's ancient lawns, and Lord Ashford was beginning to perceive the complete outline of a crime that had required not only mechanical ingenuity, but also an intimate understanding of human nature, household routine, and the precise timing that separated perfect alibis from fatal miscalculations. Inspector, he concluded, moving toward the door with quiet authority, I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed, though I suspect our murderer's most elaborate creation was not the locked room itself, but the carefully constructed persona of the grieving nephew, a performance that required rather more rehearsal than the final act could sustain. Outside, the November dusk pressed against the windows like a living thing, and somewhere in those gathering shadows, the pieces of a complex puzzle had finally arranged themselves into the uncomfortable truth that Dorothy L. Sayers' readers had learned to expect, that the most civilized settings invariably concealed the most savage secrets, and that justice, when it finally arrived, came wearing the mask of impeccable manners and unassailable logic. The November dusk had settled over Graymere Abbey with the finality of a theatre curtain when Lord Ashford announced his intention to conduct what he termed a small experiment in mechanical probability and human psychology. Inspector Meadows observed this development with the weary resignation of a man who had begun to suspect that his lordship's experiments invariably concluded with handcuffs and confessions, though never without first subjecting all present to a demonstration of their own collective blindness to the obvious. The theatrical assembly. "If you would indulge me, Inspector," Ashford said, adjusting the oil lamp on the desk to cast more dramatic shadows across the study's Persian carpet, "I should like to demonstrate how our murderer achieved the impossible, committing homicide in a locked room while maintaining the perfect alibi of being elsewhere entirely. The solution, as is so often the case, lies not in supernatural intervention, but in the precise application of mechanical principles and an intimate understanding of human routine." He had spent the intervening hour in mysterious consultation with Grimsby, whose carpenter's expertise had been enlisted for purposes that remained tantalizingly obscure. The result of their collaboration now lay ready for demonstration, awaiting its moment of revelation with the patience of a stage property carefully positioned for maximum effect. Julian Pemberton watched these preparations with mounting anxiety, his theatrical grief entirely abandoned in favor of barely concealed desperation. The confident nephew, who had swept into the room with fluttering handkerchiefs and affected sorrow, had been replaced by a man whose hands trembled and whose eyes darted constantly toward the exits with the furtive calculation of a cornered animal. The mechanical revelation, Victorian ingenuity. Ashford began, pressing against the section of paneling that yielded to reveal the concealed passage, combined with rather more contemporary criminal innovation. This priest-hole, disused for decades, provided our murderer's primary advantage, the ability to enter and exit the study without using conventional means. The narrow corridor, revealed by the removal of apparently solid oak paneling, showed clear signs of recent use. Despite decades of abandonment, dust had been disturbed in a distinct pathway, and cobwebs hung in tatters where someone had passed repeatedly in recent weeks. But the locked door presented our killer's true masterpiece. Ashford continued, producing the length of specialized cord that Grimsby had helped him reconstruct. "Observe the brass eye, so carefully installed during the window, repairs positioned with mathematical precision to guide a line without chafing or binding." With theatrical precision, he demonstrated the mechanism. The cord passed through the brass fitting, looped around the door key's shaft, and returned through the passage. A gentle pull rotated the key to the locked position. A calculated jerk snapped it back to vertical, where habit expected to find it. "The key appears locked from within, though actually controlled from without," Ashford explained, as the mechanism operated with Swiss timepiece precision, a masterpiece of applied physics, requiring only patience, planning, and an intimate knowledge of household architecture. But the murder itself required considerably more subtlety than mechanical manipulation. Ashford continued, lifting the Georgian salver from its position on the sideboard. Hodgins mentioned this piece had gone missing, most convenient for someone requiring an untraceable delivery system. He moved to the brandy decanter, noting its position and the faint residue in the glass that had sat beside Pemberton's hand. The afternoon brandy service provided our murderer's opportunity, but not through exotic skin absorption or theatrical flourishes, something far more prosaic, yet infinitely more reliable. "Doctor." Thornley stepped forward with professional interest as Ashford continued his reconstruction. Digitalis, extracted from common foxglove, dissolves readily in alcohol and remains virtually tasteless in small quantities. A fatal dose, measured with apothecary precision and introduced to the brandy during those crucial 17 minutes between the telephone alibi and Hodgins' discovery. The cardiac symptoms would manifest within 20 to 30 minutes, Dr. Thornley confirmed reluctantly. Time enough for the murderer to complete the locked room deception and establish presence elsewhere. Ashford moved to the mantel clock, its face still showing that persistent 7-minute discrepancy that had troubled him from the beginning. The timing was our murderer's most elegant deception, not coordinating the crime with Mr. Pemberton's activities, but manipulating those activities to fit a predetermined schedule. He consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision. Miss Yates recorded the Market Ledbury call at 4:21 Greenwich time. The manipulated clock showed 4:28, creating the illusion of a later timeline. Hodgins answered and confirmed Mr. Pemberton was in his study, alive and well at the established time. The mathematics were inexorable. 17 minutes. To return through the passage, administer the poison, manipulate the lock mechanism, and establish alibi elsewhere. The 7-minute clock adjustment provided the crucial buffer, ensuring the apparent time of death occurred while our murderer maintained visible presence at the Lion Hotel. But motive, Ashford continued, producing the marriage certificate discovered in Mrs. Pemberton's locket, transcended simple inheritance greed. This document records Eleanor Whitmore's marriage to Captain Frederick Finch in 1851, a union that, if legally valid, would render her subsequent marriage to Arthur Pemberton bigamous. He indicated the fragments recovered from the fireplace ashes. The Lincoln's Inn correspondence concerned inquiries into matrimonial validity. Maritime records are notoriously incomplete, particularly during wartime. If Captain Finch survived his reported demise, the entire Pemberton inheritance rested upon fraudulent foundations. Julian's face had grown ashen, but he maintained his protests with the desperation of a man watching his carefully constructed world collapse. Ancient documents prove nothing about recent deaths. You're manufacturing conspiracies from coincidental evidence. Am I indeed? Ashford's pale eyes held that distant expression that indicated calculations of considerable complexity. Though one might wonder why Mrs. Pemberton's journal speaks of secrets too precious to be sold, or why someone felt compelled to destroy urgent legal correspondence immediately upon receipt. He lifted the serpent brooch from Mrs. Pemberton's collection, its jet surface gleaming malevolently in the lamplight. Your aunt discovered the truth about her first marriage just before her death. Her refusal to alter her will would have exposed the bigamy, invalidating not only her own inheritance rights but yours as well. The brooch's hidden compartment, revealed by Ashford's careful manipulation, had once contained more than sentimental mementos. A convenient repository for storing concentrated digitalis, the same substance that ended both your aunt's life and your uncle's. 2 murders disguised as natural deaths, committed for the most ancient of motives, the preservation of fortune built upon foundations of sand. Julian's theatrical composure had deteriorated beyond repair, his hands trembling as he reached for his handkerchief with the automatic gesture of a man whose defenses had become purely reflexive. You cannot prove any of this, he protested, though his voice carried the hollow quality of a man whose alibis had been systematically demolished. Heart failure is common in elderly couples, particularly those suffering from grief and shock. Heart failure induced by carefully measured doses of digitalis is rather less common, Ashford replied with silken precision, though I suspect chemical analysis of the brandy residue will provide confirmation. The Georgian salver, so thoroughly cleaned and returned to service, may yet yield traces that careful examination could detect. The afternoon shadows had lengthened into evening darkness, and Lord Ashford was beginning to perceive the complete outline of a crime that had required not only mechanical ingenuity and chemical knowledge, but also an intimate understanding of human psychology, legal procedure, and the precise timing that separated perfect alibis from fatal miscalculations. Outside, the November wind pressed against the windows with increasing urgency, and somewhere in those gathering shadows, justice prepared to assume its familiar mask of impeccable manners and unassailable logic. The theatrical reveal was nearly complete, but the final act, the moment when all pretense would be stripped away and truth would stand naked in the lamplight, remained tantalizingly ahead, promising revelations that would make even Lord Peter Wimsey's methodical reconstruction seem merely the overture to a far more dramatic conclusion. The oil lamps flickering, glow transformed Graymere's study into a theatre of shadows as Lord Ashford positioned himself beside the concealed passage with the practiced ease of a master conjurer preparing his most elaborate illusion. Inspector Meadows had abandoned his notebook in favor of handcuffs that gleamed dully in the uncertain light, while the assembled household maintained their positions with the rigid attention of an audience awaiting the final act of a particularly gripping melodrama. "Let us begin," Ashford said with deceptive mildness, with what appeared to be a locked room but was, in mechanical terms, merely an exercise in applied physics. "You will observe, Inspector, that where most men see a key sitting stoutly in its lock, a certain sort of mind perceives a lever awaiting manipulation." With theatrical precision, he demonstrated the brass eye's function using the length of specialized cord that Grimsby had helped reconstruct. The window repairs provided our anchor point this obliging brass fitting, positioned with mathematical precision to guide a line without chafing or binding. The concealed passage, so thoughtfully reopened after decades of disuse, provided access and egress without conventional means. The cord passed through the brass eye, looped around the door key's shaft, and returned through the passage. A gentle pull rotated the key to the locked position. A calculated jerk snapped it back to vertical, where habit expected to find it. "The key appears locked from within, though actually controlled from without," Ashford explained, as the mechanism operated with Swiss timepiece precision. Julian Pemberton watched these preparations with mounting anxiety, his theatrical grief entirely abandoned in favor of barely concealed desperation. The confident nephew who had swept into the room with fluttering handkerchiefs had been replaced by a man whose hands trembled and whose eyes darted constantly toward the exits with the furtive calculation of a cornered animal. The poisoning itself required considerably more subtlety than mechanical manipulation, Ashford continued, lifting the Georgian salver with reverent care. Digitalis, extracted from the garden's abundant foxglove and dissolved in brandy, produces cardiac symptoms within 20 to 30 minutes of ingestion. The afternoon brandy service provided our murderer's opportunity, administered during those crucial 17 minutes between the telephone alibi and Hodgins's discovery. He consulted his pocket watch with theatrical precision. Miss Yates recorded the Market Ledbury call at 4:21 Greenwich time. The manipulated clock showed 4:28, creating the illusion of a later timeline. 17 minutes to traverse the passage, administer the fatal dose, manipulate the lock mechanism, and establish alibi elsewhere. "Doctor," Thornley examined the brandy glass with professional interest. "The symptoms were entirely consistent with cardiac arrest," he admitted, reluctantly. "I saw nothing suspicious in either death." "Nor were you intended to," Ashford replied, producing the marriage certificate from Mrs. Pemberton's locket. "This document represents the true motive Eleanor Whitmore's marriage to Captain Frederick Finch in 1851 rendered her subsequent union with Arthur Pemberton legally invalid. The Lincoln's Inn correspondence concerned maritime records and survivor inquiries. If Captain Finch survived his reported demise, the entire Pemberton inheritance rested upon fraudulent foundations. He indicated the fragments recovered from the fireplace ashes. Missus. Pemberton discovered this truth and refused to alter her will, despite pressure from both husband and nephew. Her death became necessary to preserve the fiction of legitimacy upon which your expectations depended." Julian's face had grown increasingly pale during this recitation. "Ancient documents prove nothing about recent deaths," he protested, though his voice carried the hollow quality of a man whose carefully constructed defenses were crumbling systematically. "Perhaps not individually," Ashford agreed, producing the serpent brooch from his waistcoat. "Though when arranged in proper sequence, they begin to resemble something rather more deliberate than coincidence. This piece, discovered in your valise beneath the spare boots, contains traces of crystalline residue that chemical analysis will identify as concentrated digitalis." The brooch's hidden compartment gleamed malevolently in the lamplight, its jet surface reflecting the accumulated evidence of 2 carefully planned murders. Julian's theatrical composure had deteriorated beyond repair, his hands trembling as he reached for his handkerchief with the automatic gesture of a man whose alibis had been systematically demolished. "The 7-minute clock adjustment provided the crucial buffer," Ashford concluded, moving toward the door with quiet authority. "Ensuring the apparent time of death occurred while you maintained visible presence at the Lion Hotel." The Abbey bell, with the obstinate veracity of parish institutions, chimed the true quarter hour and exposed your temporal deception. Julian managed, faintly, "You cannot prove. We shall see how the arithmetic pleases a jury," Ashford replied with silken precision. "Inspector, I believe we have sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges. Though I suspect our murderer's most elaborate creation was not the locked room mechanism itself, but the carefully constructed persona of the devoted nephew, a performance that required rather more rehearsal than the final act could sustain." The November wind pressed against the windows with increasing urgency, and somewhere in those gathering shadows, justice prepared to assume its familiar mask of impeccable manners and unassailable logic. The theatrical reveal was nearly complete, but the final confrontation awaited its inevitable conclusion with the patience of a perfectly constructed timepiece finally striking the hour of reckoning. The oil lamp's flickering glow had transformed Graymere's study into a theatre of shadows when Julian Pemberton's carefully constructed facade finally began its inevitable collapse. The confident nephew, who had swept into the room with theatrical grief and fluttering handkerchiefs, now stood trembling beside the mantel clock that had betrayed his elaborate chronological deception, his hands shaking as he attempted to light a cigarette with fingers that no longer obeyed his will. "You understand nothing," Julian said finally, his voice carrying the hollow quality of a man speaking from the bottom of a very deep well. "Nothing at all about what it means to watch everything slip away while maintaining the pretense of respectability. You speak as if it were mere theatre, but none of you comprehend what it is to see one's future disintegrate in the hands of a sentimental tyrant." Lord Ashford observed this collapse with the detached interest of a naturalist studying a particularly fascinating specimen. "On the contrary, Mr. Pemberton, I understand precisely what drove you to such elaborate measures, though I confess myself curious about your particular interpretation of family obligation." Julian's cigarette trembled between his lips as he struggled with the match. She was going to expose everything: the bigamy, the fraudulent inheritance, 40 years of comfortable living built upon what you so elegantly term legal fiction. Aunt Eleanor had only to sign, only to acknowledge what any reasonable woman would have done. But she preferred symbols to scents, hair bracelets and jet serpents, and sermons about the ennobling properties of pain. "You forget," Ashford observed with gentle pedantry, "that grief has always been the most self-regarding of devotions." "Proceed." Julian gave a short, strangled laugh, and the words came rushing forth as though some inner sluice had finally given way. "I knew of the phoned passage as a boy. Half the village knows. There are holes threaded through this place like a warren. When she refused to alter her will, when Arthur began speaking to those Lincoln's Inn solicitors about honorable disclosure, I realized that conventional solutions would not suffice." He moved to the concealed passage, pressing the panel with the automatic gesture of long familiarity. The digitalis was readily available from the garden. Aunt Eleanor herself had taught me to identify medicinal plants during childhood visits. Foxglove was her particular specialty, always emphasizing the importance of precise measurement. Rather ironic, considering. Inspector Meadows had produced his handcuffs, though he held them with the patience of a man recognizing that complete confessions were worth waiting for. "And the mechanical deception?" "I commissioned the window repairs specifically to provide the brass eye," Julian admitted, his confession gaining momentum like a stone rolling downhill. 17 minutes from telephone call to discovery, enough time to traverse the passage, administer the poison, manipulate the lock mechanism, and establish presence elsewhere. The clock adjustment provided insurance against miscalculation. The Maritime Office had discovered discrepancies in Captain Finch's pension records. Julian continued, his voice growing stronger as the burden of secrecy lifted. "He survived the wreck, lived quietly in Portsmouth under an assumed name. Uncle Arthur contacted them directly, threatening to expose the entire deception rather than live with fraudulent wealth. 40 years of believing myself heir to substantial fortune, only to discover it was built upon foundations of sand." Lord Ashford nodded thoughtfully. "Hence the urgent correspondence and its immediate destruction. Your uncle's conscience proved more troublesome than anticipated. He was prepared to sacrifice everything for abstract principles of honesty. Julian's voice cracked, with genuine anguish. They bred me for a place that turned out to be an error in a registry office. Why should one man's misfiled marriage condemn my life to ruin? I had creditors waiting in back rooms who do not trouble themselves with questions of legitimacy. The serpent brooch served as a portable apothecary, Julian admitted with something approaching pride in craftsmanship. Its hidden compartment held enough concentrated digitalis for several applications. I tested the mechanism for weeks. The angle had to be exact, or the key would stick halfway and make noise. The desk required shifting precisely 6 inches to accommodate the cord's path along the skirting. Ashford demonstrated once more the brass eye's function with the specialized cord. Victorian ingenuity combined with rather more contemporary criminal innovation, though your mistake lay in overcomplicating what should have been simple. The pressed white rose was perhaps excessive, Julian acknowledged with bitter humor, but I wanted something that would suggest natural death from grief rather than foul play. The old album in the attic provided the specimen Frau Karl Druschki, appropriately morbid for the occasion. You made it theatrical. Ashford corrected gently. It is the cardinal weakness of the amateur criminal. He trusts to tableau because he does not trust to arithmetic. You tampered with time, Mr. Pemberton, but the Abbey Bell does not study Cicero, and parish institutions maintain their own chronology regardless of private manipulations. Julian's cigarette had finally caught fire, though his hands shook too violently to bring it steadily to his lips. Something in Ashford's quiet finality pierced whatever last defenses he had arranged. He made a blind, clumsy movement toward the concealed passage, his hand finding the hidden seam with unerring instinct. The wood yielded, revealing the narrow corridor, and rebounded with a cry of frustration. Grimsby's broad, implacable back was wedged in the passage like a cork. The carpenter had the look of a man who intended to remain an immovable object until the end of his natural days. No, through traffic after hours, Grimsby observed in the tone of a man announcing a rule about boots in passages. Julian sagged against the desk, his theatrical composure finally collapsed entirely. It was not for money alone, he said with the stubbornness of a child defending a broken toy. It was for what should have been, for what I had been brought up to believe was mine. Why should abstract principles of truth destroy a lifetime of expectations? Because law is not sentimental, Ashford replied with quiet authority. It is merely consistent. So, too, are foxglove and gravity. They take no notice of our aspirations or our sense of entitlement. Inspector Meadows stepped forward with professional dignity. Julian Pemberton, I arrest you for the murders of Eleanor Pemberton and Arthur Pemberton. You are not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. The handcuffs closed with the finality of a church door. Julian straightened with odd elegance in defeat, his hand going automatically to his breast, as though seeking the handkerchief that had served him so tirelessly throughout the afternoon's performance. Sub Rosa, he murmured, glancing toward the window where the white ghosts of roses stood faint against the November darkness. It should have remained so. Alas, Lord Ashford observed, roses have thorns, and secrets have consequences. The one cannot exist without the other. As Inspector Meadows led the prisoner away, Ashford remained in the study, examining once more the pressed white rose that had marked Cicero's thoughts on the consolations of old age. The flower was beautiful even in its dried state, but like the crime it had been chosen to commemorate, it was ultimately an artificial creation, preserved through human intervention rather than natural process. Mrs. Betts, who had not cried throughout the entire ordeal, went quietly to the mantel and set the clock back to Greenwich time with a small, decisive movement. The mechanism resumed its obstinate ticking, impartially marking moments that would never again be manipulated for murderous purpose. How many? She whispered, not to anyone in particular, her voice carrying the weight of a woman who had witnessed the complete destruction of a household's peace. Enough, said Lord Ashford softly, slipping the pressed rose carefully back between Cicero's pages. Always enough. The lamplight flickered as somewhere a door settled with a tired sigh. Outside, the Abbey bell began its slow, dolorous tolling for the hour 11 o'clock by Greenwich time, honest and unmanipulated. In the glass face of the restored clock, The faint smear at the fore remained barely visible, a small human imperfection that refused to be polished away, bearing witness to the uncomfortable truth that even the most elaborate deceptions ultimately succumb to the persistent accuracy of time itself. The November wind pressed against the windows with increasing urgency, and Lord Ashford departed into the gathering darkness, leaving behind a house where justice had finally assumed its familiar mask of impeccable manners and unassailable logic, though at a cost that made even his methodical reconstruction seem like a Pyrrhic victory over the persistent shadows that lurked beneath the surface of respectable society.